page 37, and we turn the page actually to 37b. So let's just go over the Gemaras that we were learning. They were a little complicated because it was statements that Rabbah had said, and Rava was arguing with him. Rabbah seemed to be the more strict one, and Rava seemed to be the more lenient one. And this was we had these discussions about chatzitza. Chatzitza is like a separation, which I mentioned is very applicable when it comes to going to the mikveh, especially for women. The obligation to go to mikveh applies to them. Men often go to mikveh, but generally they're not. In today's day and age, where we're never really obligated to go to mikveh, it's more of a extra bonus for Shabbos. People go to mikveh. Some people go before davening, and even after a person has a wet dream or after having relations. The concept of going to mikveh is really it's not an obligation. It's even then it's more of a extra. But for women, going to mikveh is an obligation, and the laws of chatzitza would apply to her, which would be that there can't be any substance that separates between her and the water. And has there's many laws about it, that numerous shilas are asked on a daily basis to Rabbanim about, is this considered a chatzitza? Is that, for example, I mean, common issue that comes up at least once in people's lifetimes is lice. People, they realized afterwards that they had lice. And was their mikvah a non-kosher mikvah? It's something that's dealt with by Rabbanim. Nail polish. Someone realized after they went to mikvah that their ring might have been on, and they're not sure. And you have like a real shaila. It's a suffix. It's a doubt. But the ring, would be a chatzitza, a separation. That they have to go back. So these are all types of issues. Of course, even if a hair fell out, it's on the person's body. So that would be a chatzitza. So it's tiny, but it's separate. It separates between the body and the mikveh water. So anyway, there's numerous laws about mikveh and the laws of chatzitza. Here, the Gemara seems to use these laws regarding holding the lulav. You got to hold the lulav. What happens if something is separating between you, your hand, your grasp, your fist, and the lulav? Would that be considered a chatzitza? So here we had Rabbah telling the household of the Reish Galusa, of the exilarch. He said, when you do when you bind the lulav with the myrtle and the willow, you have to make sure to bind it a little higher up so that people can hold it on the bottom under where you're wrapping, under that binding. And this way, they're actually holding the lulav with the adasim and the aravis. But if it's going to be on the actual item that's binding the lulav, if it's on that binding material, so this would be a chatzitza, a separation. It's supposed to be holding the lulav. Rava said, kolana oisai, because it's for beauty purposes. What does that mean? You're beautifying the mitzvah. You're using you're tying up the lulav with the other species to make it beautiful. So that would not be a problem according to Rava. It's not called a chatzitza. It's like an accessory. It's you're doing it because it's l'tzorech mitzvah. Anyway, it's beauty, so it's not considered it wouldn't be a chatzitza. It's lena oisai. It's batal. It's considered nullified. It's not considered a separation. It's like part of the lulav. Now, the commentaries are all a little surprised about the way the Gemara goes from one case to the next, and it sounds like two separate, totally like separate different worlds. Then the next case that the Gemara brings is, for some reason, you're using some type of scarf to wrap around your hand, your hands, and you can't take the lulav like that. And the reason the Gemara says is because lakicha tama, you have to take a complete taking, and by wrapping the sudar, this scarf, around your hand, holding the lulav, with the scarf separating between your hand and the lulav. So the problem is, this is not a lakicha tama. This is not a complete taking. Is that the problem? That is not a complete taking? The Gemara, right a minute ago, we learned that there's a problem of chatzitza, separation. What's the Gemara jumping to some new term over here when we just mentioned right before we were talking about the issue of chatzitza, kikechi deloy teve chatzitza, the Gemara said. Rabba said. So all of a sudden the Gemara has like a whole different issue here called the kichatama. It has to be a complete taking, and here it's not a complete taking. This is something that all the commentaries struggle with trying to figure out. Is this a different problem? Is it the same problem? As we said before, the Gemara definitely sounds like it's a different issue. But the question is, why? Why is this different than the previous Gemara, which also talked about chatzitza? Just you use different terminology, chatzitza, and here it's using the terminology of lakicha tama. And the truth is, Rava sounds like he's saying something else. Rava doesn't say over here about, oh, it's for beauty, it's okay. He just says that you could take something, lakicha al yedei davar acher is called the lakicha. So seemingly Rava is also hinting to the fact that this is a different situation than the previous case, because here he doesn't say it has to be lina oisai, for beauty. Here it seems to be an issue of some other issue of lakicha tama. Has to be a complete taking, and according to Rava, when you take something by holding, when you're taking an item and your hand is wrapped in a sudar, that's not a problem. That's not an issue. But the thing is that so Rava says it's not an issue. It's called the lakicha. It's considered lakicha. What about the before? He says you need it to be for beautifying purposes. That's what makes it not a chatzitza. So this is a big topic of discussion, and it does end up making a difference in halacha how you learn this. Just to mention, the Tosfos over here goes through a long discussion and options. And finally, he comes in the Tosfos Diba'inon, in that Tosfos, he finally comes at the end. He says, you know what the second case of the Gemara is talking about? He says, it's talking about that you made some type of handle with this sudar, with this scarf, and you're somehow making like I'm not exactly sure how you tied it, but you tied it in a way that you're going to now hold onto the scarf, and you're not actually grasping the lulav. You're grasping the scarf. So when you're grasping the scarf, there's no discussion of chatzitza here. You're definitely not. What are you holding? You're not holding the lulav. When you hold the lulav, but something might be separating between your hand and the lulav. For example, the material that you bound the lulav with, So then something is separating. That's called a chatzitza. But what if you're holding on to a different item altogether? It happens to be holding the lulav in it. It's a handle, the handle of a pitcher, the handle of a sudder, of a scarf. You tied up a few knots and made a handle. That handle is what you're holding. You're not holding the lulav. Your hand is all wrapped around the scarf. It's wrapped around the scarf, made somehow a handle with it, and you're holding the scarf. So there's no concept of chatzitza here, because all you're holding is the scarf, and the scarf that you're holding, you are touching. The problem is you're not holding the lulav. Is holding the scarf that's attached to the lulav, is that called, or holding the scarf that's tied around that is has a handle to the lulav, is that called holding the lulav? So the chatzitza issue it's really a whole different story here. We're not getting to a chatzitza issue where we're questioning if you're even holding the lulav. And on that, the answer is, according to Rava, yeah, you could hold something through something else. And that's the way Tosfos understands it. That if this would actually be wrapped around the lulav, you'd have a problem of chatzitza maybe, unless it's beautiful. But if it's not wrapped around it, you're just holding something that's holding the lulav. So you're holding the handle. That is not a problem of chatzitza. It sounds a little surprising, because you would think it's even worse, right? It sounds like it's even worse. You're not even holding the item. Normally, a chatzitza, you're holding the item, but there's a chatzitza separating, but you're actually holding the item. Here, you're not holding the item at all. You're holding an alternative item, a different item, a secondary item. And that secondary item is what is holding the lulav. And yet, that's going to be okay, according to Rava, even though it's not lina oisai to beautify it, because look, he has a certain rule, lakicha yadei davar acher. You can hold things through something else. That's called the lakicha. So it comes out an interesting law according to the way Tosfos is learning. Again, this Tosfos de Ba'inon, and he says that you're holding like the handle. It's not a chatzitza because the whole lulav is outside of his hand. All you're holding is a handle, and a handle that is protruding from the scarf. And he says this is similar to the azov, which was the hyssop that you are attaching to some other item, like a chut, like the string or some type of needle. And Rava holds shemo lekicha, that's called taking. So that is a one way of, I guess, answering this problem. Others commentaries want to say that really the previous Gemara that said the term chatzitza really also means that it's the concept of lekicha tama that the Gemara says in the second paragraph. Yeah. The second paragraph, it says this term lekicha tama, taking something completely. The first paragraph, even though it uses the term that it's chatzitza, really what it means is it's not a lekicha tama. It's not a complete taking. And that was the meaning of the first paragraph, even though the wording is not there. So that's a little like forced interpretation. It seems surprising that the Gemara would say that, use a different terminology, even though it really means lekicha tama. But I guess the reason why that commentary feels we're forced to say it that way is because we don't have any source that there's a law of chatzitza by lulav. In other words, there are laws about chatzitza, separation, things that separate, like in the mikvah. And those laws about chatzitza, those laws, there's verses, there's a pasuk that implies you can't have a chatzitza, that spells it out. By lulav, it doesn't say any law about chatzitza. So because of that problem, this commentary wants to understand it, that it must be that it doesn't mean it so literally. It's sort of loosely using that term chatzitza. Really, the concept is lekicha tama. They're similar concepts, lekicha tama and chatzitza. Kichatama means taking it completely, and chatzitza means a separation. So they are similar concepts. So one of the commentaries wants to say it doesn't say any laws of chatzitza in lulav. So it must be that it was using that term loosely, and really what it means is the lekichatama concept. Anyway, we now saw what Tosfos says. We have this other commentary about the that really is the same thing. Okay, anyway, that's the first two pieces over here about holding the lulav with some type of separation or with some other item. And then Rava says, well, how do I know this law about lekicha al yedei davar acher, taking something through something else? Is that called taking? And the comparison the Gemara gives is to a case where we learn about the para aduma. And the para aduma, the concept over there was that you have to dip the azoiv. The azoiv was three stems of hyssop, and you dip it in this para, the ashes, the water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. And so the problem was, if you have a small hyssop that's not long, and you're trying to stick it into a tube to get some of the water, the mechatos, this water, this red heifer water, and the problem is it doesn't reach it, and you got a tube, and it's long, and so what do? So there's different ways, by pushing it in, tying to some type of string to it, or somehow putting maybe like the needle that they use to weave, spindle. They would push the whatchamacallit in and pull it out with it by attaching it to it. So there you would somehow make it longer, and make the hyssop that's short, make it longer, and ultimately you're able to dip it into the red heifer water, and so then you can take it out, and when you take it out, you hold on to the azoiv and you sprinkle. And so the Gemara asks, why are you able to do that? It says that you're supposed to dip it into the red heifer water, and instead what it seems like is you're using some other item to dip it into the red heifer water, and the halacha, the Mishnah says it's kosher. So how does that work? So it must be, Rava says, I have a proof from here that if you use some other item to push something else in, using a different item is considered lakicha, that's taking. In other words, if I take it holding something else, that's called taking. If I wrap around the sudder, if I wrap around the scarf around my hand and take it with the scarf, or hold something through something else, that's called and take it, that's called taking. So the Gemara says maybe over there it's different because you tied it together when you attach the spindle to the hyssop. It was tied together. Here you're just wrapping something around your hand. That's not necessarily called taking. There, when you take one thing, the other thing is automatically part of it. That's taking. So you could differentiate and say our case it's not a good proof to our case. So therefore, the Gemara says no. We have another Mishnah there in Tractate Para that now we have a different proof, similar type of situation where you have another similar laws, or it's the same topic. It's regarding para aduma, the ashes, mixing the ashes with the water of the para red heifer. And the problem was that you're supposed to put it in yourself. And here it fell. The ashes fell from the tube. They had ashes in this tube. They had collected them. And they're supposed to be mixed with the water, which is in a trough. And the thing is, if it falls on its own, it's puzzle. It's not valid because you have to put it yourself. You you need to take the ashes and put it in to the water. So the law is that if it falls in, it's not. If it falls in, it's not kosher. What happens if you pushed it in? The Gemara asks, which is Rava is really talking. So Rava is saying, you see from that Mishnah that the only problem is if it falls in, because you didn't have intent. But the fact that it was being poured in through a or you push it in through a tube, that's not a problem. So what do you mean you didn't actually put it in? You see that even though you didn't actually do it, that nevertheless it's considered lakicha al yedei davaracha. You took it through the tube. That is considered taking, and that is considered putting it into the water. So bottom line is that you see from here, at least Rava sees it as a proof to his law that if you take something through something else, that's called taking, and therefore the same thing should apply to a lulav. That you have to take the lulav. If you take it through holding on to the sudar, that's also called taking. So he has some type of proof. Again, we had different ways of learning the case, because what is the case of the sudar? Again, it seemed to have two issues. One was the chatzitza issue, and the other is the lakicha tama issue. There seem to have been maybe two issues, depending on the different commentaries. And so how do you deal with that? Then you have to say that here, according to Taisvis, the way we learned, and the other case. So this is a case where you're using you're pushing the ashes in by using a shveiferes, by using this tube that the ashes are in. Somehow you're throwing in the ashes into the water, and that's considered taking the ashes, even though you didn't touch the ashes, and you're just holding the tube. You're throwing it in through the tube. That's considered good enough. That's called taking. The same thing could apply to lulav. It's called taking. That's the way Rava understands it. That was the second case that we had learned about these arguments, Rabba, and Rava. Then came the third case, and that was loilodotz inish lulava b'hishana, that you shouldn't stuff the squeeze in the lulav into the tied up hishana, the bundle. Don't squeeze in the lulav into it. And because we're afraid natri tarfi are leaves, natri, it'll loosen the leaves, it'll cause them to fall, it'll cause the leaves to fall off, and the leaves of the hadassim and the aravis, and this will be considered a chatzitza between each of the species, and they won't be considered all tied together. And Rava says that it's min b'mina, it's not chaytzitz, it's not a problem. We mentioned yesterday that what does Rabba really hold? Does Rabba hold it's a problem? Min b'mina. Min b'mina means if it's the same species, is that what Rabba says it's still a problem? Or maybe Rabba holds it's a suffix, at least. It's a suffix if it's a problem. Might be, it's a doubt. There might be a problem. Anyway, the bottom line is Rava is lenient. Rabba is more strict. Rabba is concerned about these loosening the leaves when you stuff in that lulav, which is something that happens. The lulav falls out. I guess not in the Ashkenazic lulav. I guess that's not an issue. It's more the other the people who don't use the handle for the lulav. The people who don't use that whole keshala. They use some other, they wrap it around with just the rings like Lubavitch and I think maybe Spartan. So for us, it happens once in a while, the lulav slips out. So when you stuff in the lulav, it could be loosening the leaves. This would be a problem according to Rabbah According to Rava, it's called min b'minai. It's not chaytzitz. It doesn't matter. Even if a leaf falls off, it shouldn't be a problem. You don't have to worry about it. This is according to Rava. Then the Gemara says that loylegas inish lulava, you shouldn't cut off if the lulav is too long. You want to cut it off. Now, first of all, you can't cut off on the top. Then you would invalidate your lulav. But you want to cut it off on the bottom. So the problem is it's inside your bundle. It's all bundled up together. It's tied together. So what's going to happen? There's going to be leaves that are going to be unconnected, disconnected when you cut it, because basically the way the lulav works is there's two leaves that go out of many junctures throughout the lulav. Every inch there's another two leaves that go out. They don't, of course, the lulav is tight, but so you don't always see these leaves as a separate entity, but they really are. When you cut off a piece of your lulav on the bottom, which sometimes is important to do, because maybe your sukkah is very short and you don't want it to, so you might want to, if you have a very long lulav, there's nothing wrong with cutting off a piece on the bottom. And what happens is when you cut it off, you'll see that once you snip it, so if like every 2 inches, every inch that you snip it high, 2 leaves are going to fall off, because there's 2 leaves going out of the lulav every few centimeters or inches. So basically, if it's already tied into the hadassim and aravos, you already tied all of the 3 species together, and then you snip it. What happens is there's going to be some loose leaves of the lulav that are going to become detached because you snipped it. And if you snipped it 4 inches high, you probably are going to have about 4 leaves, maybe 6 leaves, 8 leaves that are going to be detached. So, of course, Rabbah is worried about this. Chatzitza. And Rava says, min b'minai einay chaytzit. So this is like really very similar to the previous case. And the commentaries do deal with that. Like, it seems like it's redundant. Isn't this the same exact thing? One was talking about the leaves of the hadassim and aravis. The previous thing we just learned, the previous case and this case seem to be it seems to be about the same, pretty much the same. It's the same thing. It's all. I hold it's a chatzitza. You hold it's a. Rabbah holds it's a problem. Rabbah holds it's not a problem. It's the same issue. Is min b'mina chatzitza. Min b'mina. It's the same species, but nevertheless, it could be considered a separation between the between the species. Now, the commentaries try to explain that if it only said the first case of loy lodotz about the issue with the leaves of the hadassim. So what we're concerned that you might think that the reason is that the hadassim leaves will separate between the lulav and the arava, or the arava leaves will separate between the lulav and the hadas. And then it would be considered min b'she'enoi minoi according to everyone. So that was the reason why that's what you might think in the first case. So therefore, when it says the second case, not to cut the lulav leaves, and because the leaves of the lulav are going to be a chatzitza. So here you see clearly that you seemingly you see that that's not the meaning of the earlier case. So when it says loy ligos, not to cut the lulav, and so Rabbah here says that the previous case was not a problem of min b'she'enoi minoi. Here, Rabbah clearly is saying this is still a problem. What do you mean still a problem? The leaves of the lulav are not separating between the hadassim and the aravos. I didn't move anything in the lulav with the way it's situated. I kept it where it is. I just snipped the bottom. So all the leaves of the lulav are separating between the lulav and the hadassim or the lulav and the aravos. It's not moving anything. And so therefore, what you see is, at least in Rabbah, you see that the reason earlier was not because of min b'she'enoi minoi, but Rabbah's reason is even min b'minoi, that it's even because of min b'minoi is it's clearly that's the reason it's a chatzitza, even if it's the same species. And even min b'minoi is a problem. Now, what about the other? What about if it just said the loyliga is inish lulava? So in the case of the second case, so it would basically be saying that Rabbah holds min b'minoi is min b'minoi, even though this is a case of the same species, it nevertheless is invalid. You shouldn't do that. Don't do that, because it'll be a chatzitza, it'll be a problem. So and Rava say it's not a problem. It's min b'minoi. It's not a problem. It's min b'minoi. It's not a chatzitza. Rava, we wouldn't know what he would hold in the case of stuffing your lulav into the bundle that there's hadassim and aravos there, because there you might have an issue of min b'she'enoi, and therefore it needs to say both cases. So again, the reason why it doesn't only say the first case is to show you that Rabbah holds his law even by a case where it's min b'minoi, he still says it's invalid. Rava, the reason why the Gemara doesn't just say the second case is because it wants to show you that Rava's law of min b'minoi einoi chaytzetz even applies even to the first case, that Rava's not concerned that an hadas leaf or an arava leaf will interpose between the different species, and it's not min b'minoi, you might think. And the answer is that Rava holds it's not a problem. Min b'minoi, it's still called min b'minoi. It's not chaytzetz. It's not a problem, even in that case. So each one is adding something that you might not know without mentioning both laws, because each one adds some a different element. The first case of stuffing the lulav into the bundle, it adds an element of, there's a thought that issue there, the issue might be a very serious issue, because your hadas leaf might interpose between the lulav and the arava, or the arava leaf might interpose between the lulav and the hadas. So that would be possible to understand from that first case, and therefore we have the second case that sheds light on that. The difference of the second case, this additional case of not to cut the lulav. This is not about stuffing the lulav in. This is about cutting it, giving it a trim on the bottom. This has a different element to it, and that is that here you don't have there's definitely no min b'she'enoi minoi here. There's no issue of two different species, because the lulav leaves that are going to be detached and stuck inside, and you might say that maybe they're separating. These leaves are definitely called min b'minoi. They're definitely called the same species, because the lulav leaves that are cut are going to stick around right there next to the lulav. So it's called part and parcel. It's definitely the same species as the lulav. And therefore, you don't have a problem of, definitely not an issue of min b'she'enoi minoi here. In the earlier case, you did have such an issue. So again, that would be a reason why there's a difference between these two cases. In each one, you couldn't get away with just learning one. Okay, then comes the another case where we've talked about smelling a esrog and smelling a hadas. And that law was Rabbah said that the hadas of the mitzvah you're not allowed to smell, an esrog of the mitzvah that you're allowed to smell, and the reason was hadas is l'reichakoi. Hadas is for meant for smelling. That's the what it's used for. What do people use myrtles branches for? They use it to smell. So when you are going to use this for the mitzvah, you're separating yourself from using it for its regular use, and you're using it for a mitzvah. It's called aktsiye. That's the same word as muktzah. Muktzah. Many people don't know what the word where the word comes from. Where does the word muktzah comes from? It's from this word aktsiye. Muktzah, everyone knows on Shabbos. You're not allowed to touch this. Oh, it's muktzah. That's muktzah. You can't move that. You can't move anything because it's muktzah. It has no use. It's used for prohibited purposes. All these things are called muktzah. But the concept of muktzah means that you've separated it from your mind. What have you separated from your mind with regard to the hadas and the esrog? Well, you're using these items, these species for the mitzvah, and you're not going to use them for what they're regularly used for. So when you separated the hadas for the mitzvah, basically you're saying it's no longer going to be used. It's no longer going to be used for smelling. What about the esrog? You're saying no longer going to be used for eating and squeezing into my tea. That's what I'm using. I'm using this esrog for the mitzvah. It's meant to be eaten, the esrog. The hadas is meant to be smelled. The esrog is meant to be eaten. And when I'm separating it for the mitzvah, I'm removing it from the regular pleasure that it's used to. And therefore, the esrog should be allowed. You should be allowed to smell the esrog. The hadas you would not be allowed to smell. Now, the next Gemara said is the new piece. Actually, we didn't learn this together. So the next Gemara is
Rabbi.
Yes, David.
There's a bracha on smelling the esrog. Brachat Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam hanosein reach tov b'peros.
Right, but you mentioned that there's a shaila about it yesterday.
Yeah, I was reading two different things. One says there's a shaila, and the other thing says that it's not a shaila. So I don't know.
Contradiction in the same book.
Yeah, but it's a different note. One says, with regard to the esrog, the assumption is one is aware that they not eat it, which is its primary function. Therefore, even if he smells it on Shabbos, he'll be careful not to detach it from the tree. See,
okay, that's the next Gemara. Detach from the tree. That's really on the next Gemara. If you want, you could repeat what you read yesterday, because I think that was on this Gemara. But what did you want to just read that one more time? Because that was the what did it mention there about this suffix, about the esrog?
Yeah, right? It says it's prohibited to smell the hadas because it's being used for the mitzvah of the daled minim. Technically, one may smell the esrog being used for the daled minim. However, since there's a dispute, Ra'avya, Rabbeinu Simcha in the Mordechai, whether one recites a bracha when smelling the esrog, one should refrain from smelling it due to the uncertainty. Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim 653:1. I mean, over the years we've always smelled the esrogs. That's why.
And you say a bracha?
Yeah. Brachat Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam hanosein reach tov b'peros.
And that is on Sukkot. On Sukkot, you would smell the esrog.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with anyone that has a minhag to smell the esrog and say a bracha on it on Sukkot. I've never heard of anyone doing that. If I remember correctly, in the Svarim that they write, like they have like write-ups about the esrogim, you're not supposed. I don't think you're supposed to, and I guess it's based on this about this shaila about the bracha. I could pull up the Shulchan Aruch here. Let me see if I have it. Can pull it up. Yeah, in Halacha 653.
No, it's a 6. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, 653:1.
Yeah, let's see. Shulchan Aruch or Chaim, 653. The hadas of a mitzvah it's prohibited to smell, but the esrog of a mitzvah it's mutter mitlahariach ba min adin. But because they argue about if you make a bracha on it, if not, you should refrain from smelling it. If one of the four species was made for use as one of the four species, but was not lifted to fulfill the obligation, it is still permissible to get benefit from it by using it for a non-mitzvah purpose. So this applies if it's being used. Let's just see if the Mishnah Berurah says anything here. That even though on Shabbos you're not going to use it, nevertheless it's already set aside. Um, uh, um, it's huktzah l'chol shiva. It's set aside for all 7 days, and that's at least the hadas. One second. It's also lahariach. The Mishnah says because ikroi einai ela lahariach. Its main purpose is only to smell, and for that is what you separated it, just like the wood of the sukkah. But the esrog, it's mainly for eating. And this is all that it was separated for, not from smelling. This is exactly our Gemara. But they do argue about the bracha of hanois and reach toiv beperis, because some say since it's not meant for smell because it's shel mitzvah, so therefore ein levarich olav, you shouldn't because it's being used for the mitzvah, so it's not avida l'reicha mipnei shehu shel mitzvah ein levarich olav. You shouldn't say a bracha on it, and so ayin beis Yosef shema Rashba. Maybe you could make a tanai if a tanai works. If you could make a condition, anyway. Then it says that lahariach milahariach ba, that because people they don't say a bracha on the esrog because of this problem, so they prevent them, they refrain from smelling it. So it says in the Mishnah Berurah they refrain when they take it for the mitzvah, but before or after, um, according to everyone, you could say a bracha, and some say all 7 days you refrain from taking it. In Ayin Lo'el Siman Reshiyud Vav Sham Biyarnu Kol Pratei Adin, in chapter 216, the Mishnah Berurah says he talks about this more, all the specifics in chapter 216, which is the laws of smelling, and so that's really probably the original 216 is the laws of smelling, brachas on smell, brachas hareach.
What about the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch?
Yeah, the Alter Rebbe we could look at as well. He also has the Seder Berachas Hanenin. But anyway, I'm not going to take any more time. But maybe we'll look it up and see about this concept of saying a bracha of the Mirech be'esrog shal mitzvah mavarich olav yesham sheina mavarich. It's the last paragraph in chapter 216. It says a person who smells the esrog of a mitzvah says a bracha. Some say you don't make a bracha, therefore better don't smell it. And I guess this is where the Mishnah Berurah probably has some lengthy. Let's take a look if the Mishnah Berurah here. Ayin Bir Halacha. He directs you to his other book. So he mentions an interesting thing. He says Some say not to say a bracha on it because it's not a reach choshuv that it's fit to say a bracha on. So anyway, to be looked into what exactly that's referring to. It's not considered significant, the reach choshuv, that it's fit to say a bracha on. So that's a interesting point. We'll have to look that up in the original source. All right. Anyway, so that just touches on this concept. I'm not so familiar. I don't know if anyone else is saying a bracha and smelling the esrog during Sukkot. Not when you're doing it, not when you're lifting it for the mitzvah, and throughout Sukkot as well. I don't think I've seen anyone. I don't think I'm familiar with people doing that. If I remember correctly, the common tradition is not to say it, not to smell it or say a bracha.
Question.
Yes.
Suppose there are two sets of Abba Minim, your
Right.
set, and let's say your son's set.
Uh-huh.
And you're saying it's set aside for 7 days for the specific purpose of the Abba Minim. But what if you take your sons and make a
in other words, if he sets it aside, does that prohibit you from benefiting from it? And the fact that yours is set aside for your mitzvah, is that prohibited for him to benefit from it? And then shul, can you use someone else's lulav esrog and smell their esrog or hadas just because they set it aside for the mitzvah? Would you be eligible to say a bracha on it? Right. That's a interesting question, but it seems like that it doesn't matter. Once it's set aside for the mitzvah, it doesn't matter whose it is. It's set aside for the mitzvah, and we don't benefit from it. Otherwise, I guess people would do it all.
Even though you didn't set his aside for the mitzvah.
Right, but he set it aside for the mitzvah, or he's using it for the mitzvah, right?
Yeah.
If he's using it for the mitzvah, I mean that's so he's setting it aside, as it would seem. But if you're asking maybe before, that could be different. Before Sukkot, before the time to maybe you could say a bracha before.
How about past the first 2 days?
No, I think the question would be, when does it kick in? The question I think would be, would you be allowed to say a bracha on the hadas at night, the night of before it kicks in the obligation by day? Is it already hooked when Yom Tov comes in? It's already set aside for the mitzvah once Yom Tov, once it gets dark, or does the prohibition does it sort of like get set aside when you actually use it? Because that's what it seemed like from that second paragraph, 693. From that second section, second part of the sentence there, it seemed like it was only if you actually used it. So I'm guessing that before you, or even the morning, right? Let's say it's the morning before you use it. Would you be allowed to say a bracha to smell, and then on the hadas, and afterwards use it for the mitzvah? Yeah, I guess that's an interesting question. I have to look it up. All right. So anyway, getting back, let's do the new piece of Gemara here. So we're on page 37b, and we are the Amar Rabba Hadas b'mechuber. The Amar Rabba, it must be about 12 lines from the top. 12 lines from the top of the page. The Amar Rabba. And Rabbah says, Hadas b'mechuber. If the hadas is attached to the ground, mutter lahariach boy on Shabbos. This is not necessarily a Shabbos of Sukkot. This is just on Shabbos. Any Shabbos, you have a myrtle. It's attached. It's I guess it's a tree, so it's attached to the tree. But it's mutter lahariach boy. You are allowed to smell it on Shabbos without touching it, without moving it. Esrog b'mechuber, but an esrog that's attached to the tree. Osir lahariach bay. On Shabbos, you would not be allowed to smell it. My timer, what's the reason? Hadas is more lenient. The previous case we saw that the hadas is more strict. The hadas, it's also lahariach boy. You can't. Esrog would be mutter to smell. It's only an issue of a bracha, but really you could smell an esrog on Yom Tov. Here we're saying the opposite. Hadas, excuse me, hadas is more strict on Shabbos. Hadas, if it's attached to the ground, attached to the tree, you're allowed to smell it. The esrog is more strict. The esrog you can't smell on Shabbos. What's the reason? My timer. So hadas de lahariach boy. Hadas is meant to smell. That's what you do with it. You go, I got a good, you smell it. That's a nice smell. Isharisle, if we permit you to smell it, loy asi lemigzia, you're not going to cut it off. You're just interested in smelling it. So you smell it. What's the big deal? Esra de la chilakai, but esrog that is usual for eating. That's what its use is for eating. Isharisle, if we permit you to smell it, asi lemigzia, you're probably gonna, oh, this actually smells nice and ripe and juicy, and I'm gonna, you might come to cut it off on Shabbos, and so therefore you'll forget it's Shabbos, you'll end up cutting it off, and therefore there's a prohibition to smell it. So therefore, a esrog ends up being more strict on Shabbos than a hadas. I do want to mention that there's an important Rashi over here. Rashi says, "Aser lahariach boy," and it's really on the previous paragraph that it's prohibited to smell the hadas of the mitzvah. So Rashi says that where does this come from? This prohibition? He says it's gamrinon misukkah. We learn from Sukkah that we learned in the first chapter, Dechal Shem Shamayim al Atze Sukkah liyaser bahana, that the name of Hashem, meaning the holiness, is affects the wood of the sukkah that it's prohibited to benefit from all 7 days, since it's huktzu lemitzvah, since it's set aside for the mitzvah, and the same law would apply to the hadas, that it becomes asur bahana. What's the source of the prohibition? That it's once set aside for the mitzvah becomes prohibited for benefit. It seems to be connected to this idea. Rashi understands it that it's connected to this concept of that the sukkah is prohibited to benefit from. Chal Shem Shamayim al Atze Sukkah, that Hashem's name is affects the wood of the sukkah to be prohibited in Hana all 7 days. So the same thing would apply to the hadas. So that was the previous Gemara. Now, there might be a hint over there to the fact that all 7 days is prohibited. That maybe, if we're saying that it has like Chal Shem Shamayim, that Hashem, that the concept of holiness affects it. So maybe it does mean that it kicks in from the beginning of Yom Tov. It's not 100% proof, but it seems to have a little hint there that maybe from the beginning of Yom Tov already, it's considered Huksul Mitzvah. That's not 100% proof, so I have to look it up. But anyway, there's the origin of this. At least we have Rashi tells us it's from the laws of Sukkah. Chal Shem Shamayim al Atze Sukkah. Okay. Now comes the next. The next piece is Ba'amar Rabba. Rabba says lulav biyamin, the yesrog, the lulav you hold in the right hand, the yesrog in the left hand. And we actually saw earlier in this chapter that to the extent that if a person did it wrong, he's going to switch his hands and it might fall. The esrog, we were nervous if it's too big of an esrog, So this is a halakha that it's supposed to be the right hand. You're supposed to hold the lulav, in the left hand you hold the esrog. In my time, what's the reason? Hani tlasa mitzvahs. This is 3 mitzvahs, and Bahai chada mitzvah. And this, the esrog, is only 1, and therefore, since you have such a large amount of the mitzvah, you should do it with the more honorable hand, and that is the right hand. Now, what happens if you didn't do it? So it's brought down. Some say that it's puzzle, similar to if you put the species in the wrong, you held them wrong, opposite their way of growth. This would maybe be the same, but there's other opinions that say, but the Yeved, you are Yoitza, you do fulfill the mitzvah, and it's different than the other case where you turned it upside down. So what should you do if you did it in the wrong hand? You should go and shake again without a bracha, because there are some that say you weren't Yoitza. What about a lefty? So this is a topic also of discussion. What about a lefty? For a lefty, does that mean that their left hand is more their honorable hand? And so the Rishonim argue about this. We have to take a look at Shulchan Aruch, what it says. Anyone here a lefty? Anyone know what the common minhag is? Do we have any lefties amongst us? Okay. Yes. Oh, Ezra. Tell us. So what do you do? You hold the esrog in your left hand because you're a lefty?
To be very honest with you, yeah,
You forgot.
I hold the etrog in my left hand. No, I hold the etrog in the right hand, just as everybody else does.
Just like everyone else.
Mm.
And you're a real lefty, like you write with your left hand, you do everything with your left hand?
No. I was an original lefty. I visit. When I see you again, I will tell you the entire story. I was a lefty. I was forced to become right-handed, and when they had to determine whether or not I would put my tefillin on, the rabbi told me to put it in the usual way, just as right-handed people would.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
So now when you write, do you write with your left hand?
No, I write with my right hand, but I bat left-handed. I wear my baseball glove on my right hand, as opposed to a righty who puts it on his left hand. So, because I throw with my left hand.
I see. All right. So yeah, you got a complicated case over there.
So you're amphibious. I mean ambidextrous. I'm just making a joke.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
What?
All right, we're gonna stop here to be continued. Sei gesund. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You too, Rabbi.